Baldur's Gate 3 might just be the greatest game I've ever played. That's a little bit of a bold statement. Welcome back to the channel, by the way. I know it's been a little while. I do apologize for not uploading as much as I probably should have or would have liked to, which have been pretty busy. But as I said, bold statement, Baldur's Gate 3. And I'm a person who's played a lot of games. I studied a games design degree. My life since I was a kid has been revolved around video games in a lot of ways, and it's my first passion. So I'm at that point in my life where I'm not far off 23, where, you know, not only do I find it hard to find the time to play games because I'm very busy with work and obviously YouTube on my main channel, but it's hard for me to get motivated and captivated by any title. It doesn't matter what the genre is. Obviously, I'm more of a single player gamer, generally speaking. But even now, I struggle to, find that motivation to play a game. Usually when I do, I spend so much time looking at my Steam library. By the time I even pick one, I'll pick it up, open it for 10 minutes, and then I'll get pretty bored and just want to shut it down, and I'll repeat the process until I gotta go to sleep. And that's obviously not a healthy way of looking at it. So when a game like Baldur's Gate 3 comes along, and I genuinely can't think of anything else I want to do other than play it, and I'm getting sad thinking about putting the game down when I'm playing it, I think that's a pretty good indication of a masterpiece. And when you can acknowledge something's greatness, it doesn't matter if it's a game or a piece of media, whatever it is, when you're in the moment and you can acknowledge that moment and realize how good this particular thing is, I think that's when you're in the midst of something special. And Baldur's Gate 3 is, Larian Studios, it's their masterpiece, it's their magnum opus. Obviously, they worked on Divinity and Divinity 2, which I actually just started, and I'm trying to find the time to play it. And, they were very well received, but quite, smaller in scale and in terms of sales. Baldur's Gate 3 really broke that mold. It's not a typical game that appeals to the mainstream. It's a isometric, turn-based, RPG. It's naturally just not a genre that appeals to the masses, a la Call of Duty, first-person shoot, etc. But by the merit of it being so critically successful, it really just exploded into the wider market because of how generationally brilliant it was. I think all the critics acknowledged how good it was. And, I know a lot of people like to criticize the critics and prefer to look at their own reviews and general fan reception. Baldur's Gate 3 really just ticked all the boxes on both ends. And I think that just general hearsay came around. And that's part of the reason why it's done so well. And I was one of those people in particular. It's not a game I'd probably look at and say, oh, I really want to play this. The only reason I did is because I convinced my friends to play it because of the rule set it uses. If you don't know, Baldur's Gate 3 uses the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, which, pretty much faithfully one-to-one, barring a couple of quality of life changes. You bring that pen and paper, all the mechanics from it, essentially to a video game, which is the crux of why it's so brilliant. And that's what got me invested. I wasn't really particularly, the art style didn't excite me too much. Graphically it looks nice, but obviously there's much better games out there, visually. But I love the D&D rule set. I love Dungeons & Dragons, so I was like, let's give it a crack. And I don't think we really knew what we were in for. Obviously, I think people who played it before, it was in an early access period for a long time. And at the time, only the first act was playable until full release. And when we were going through it, this is when the full release came out, we were playing through it, we're like, how long is this game? Because the website How Long to Beat, which gives you an average on how long gamers take to finish it at any particular title, said about 35 hours, pretty ample, but for a AAA price that we were paying, and we were like, we don't really feel like we're end of the story here. Something's got to be amiss here. And it turns out, of course, they hadn't updated the times. So we just finished Act 1. We're like, this can't be the end of the game, right? And lo and behold, it wasn't. And we ended up spending about triple that. And I think it's one of the only games in a modern age where really consumers aren't really getting their money's worth. A lot of unfinished products, rushed titles. I think of stuff like Concord, which was, in many ways just a complete failure critically and commercially. That's probably the best example. But, there's a general sentiment within the games industry that we're not really getting, the titles that are worth $60, now $70 if you're in America. I think Baldur's Gate 3 really just challenges that entirely. It's one of the few games I played in recent memory, AAA, that I can safely say is worth the full price. Hell, I wouldn't even be mad paying double for it. That's how good it is. And, I spoke about the D&D rule set, and it's one of those tricky things to even bring to a video game. But the fact that Larian did it so successfully If you played the game, you'll know what I'm talking about. But mechanically, across combat and outside of it, they've designed it and put everything together so that it's completely flexible. And anything you want to try and do, using out of the box thinking like you would in Dungeons and Dragons, that you're able to, using your imagination, they let you do it as close as possible within, the confines of a video game that they've put together. They really don't limit you in what you can do. I think of a best example in the early stages of the game, so I won't spoil too much here if you haven't played it. But there was we were trying to figure out how to approach this combat encounter. We were massively outnumbered, under-leveled even. And I was like, well, why don't we just think like we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? So what we did is we put a load of explosive barrels together by the big boss enemy, hid in the rafters above in this big stone castle, and shot a fire arrow to ignite it all the way from above, and ended up obliterating every single person instantly without even starting combat. And the game didn't tell us to do that. It didn't even give us hints, but because of the fact we played Dungeons and Dragons, we had that intuition. And the best part of it is you don't even need that. It's one of those games where you're willing to just think out of the box a little bit. The game will probably let you do what you're trying to. And that's what makes it so brilliant. And narratively, I think it's very special as well. Obviously, I'm talking about the combat for the most part here. But as a narrative, it is quintessential Dungeons and Dragons. You're the chosen one, if you will. I know it's nothing new in any piece of media, generally speaking, but they execute it very well. And it's one of the few games, especially now, where your decisions genuinely matter. I think that's a common trope and a big selling point, USP in a lot of titles these days, when it really doesn't really shit at all. Walking Dead was probably one of the best examples, infamously, the Telltale games back from about 10, 12 years ago. And even then, they didn't really follow that mantra, particularly in the later seasons at all. You were very much railroaded or presented with the illusion that your choices actually matter, when outside of a couple of instances, they didn't at all. Baldurs Gate 3 is a game that's 10 times the size of that in terms of scale, and they achieve that goal far more effectively. You have decisions that really matter, particularly within characters and their specific arcs. You can have characters, NPCs you might accidentally kill. I've got a friend who killed one of the main characters, the main, party members that can join you and your crew for the entire game, right? And he killed him within the first 10 minutes, not thinking he was an actual main character or a big deal. And for his entire playthrough, he never knew who this guy was because of the fact the game let him do that. And obviously that just is a bit of an outside perspective. But even in cases where you have to make critical decisions in the story, they really matter. And people end up on two different paths entirely in their game experiences. So no two experiences are the same, generally speaking. And I think that's what makes the game so special, because your decisions, as I said, they actually have a lot of weight. They carry weight and they mean something. By the end of the game, you feel fulfilled with your decisions if you made the right or wrong ones. And but by that extension, it makes you get so much more attached to the characters in particular to join your party, because you really feel like you're influencing them and what they're doing and their motivations. And they're all very well written, superbly voice acted. Obviously it was pretty much clean sweep at all of the game awards. Every single one of them, in particularly the voice acting, which, as I said, you have to just commend it. Very well put together. Neil Newborn, who plays Asterion, he's a vampire rogue kind of character. Obviously he's a particular highlight that I'm sure most people know about by now. And as much as I say it is the greatest game ever made, and it did take me a while to really cement that opinion. I was very back and forth, and Witcher 3 is one of my all-time favorites, and there's a few others that I probably haven't even talked about on this channel yet. But this was always a video I wanted to make. But it doesn't mean the game's perfect. I don't think any game is, nor will any game or piece of media will be. It's still a 10 out of 10, and the reason I call it a 10 out of 10 is because it does everything it tries to achieve, and then some. It goes above and beyond. But there are problems with it. I think particularly at launch, performance was always a big issue. I've got a decent computer by modern standards, and especially in Act 3, my computer was fighting for its life trying to put everything together. I was, dropping to around 20 frames per second at times, which does take you out of an experience which prides itself on immersion and really getting involved with these characters in this particular world that Larian have created. When you have performance issues and visual glitches and, the occasional T-posing and loading errors, blurry textures, etc., it does kind of take you out a little bit. Fortunately, it wasn't a huge roadblock for me. I've been through stuff like that before. It's not the end of the world, but everyone's experience is going to be different. And another thing, Act 3 in general, as I spoke of, this is generally a pretty common sentiment, is that it's quite bloated and overwhelming. And that's something I definitely agree with. When you get into Act 3, you're reaching the real climax of the game. but they open you with the biggest area of the entire game up until now, and about 1,000,000 different quest markers and things to do, and it almost feels a bit surgical, and you have to be you're almost going through a list, right? It does feel like a bit like a chore. I think of like the bounty system in Destiny, which I think I spoke about. It's not fun, it's a chore. I wouldn't say Baldur's Gate 3 really stoops to that level, but there's definitely an element of it there. But to counter that, I'd say the quests are very fun anyway, and I was enjoying every single minute, and I didn't really want to put the game down. So the longer it went on, the more fun I was having. So that was never really a huge issue for me, but I understand there was a lot of complaints with that. But I think, Larian have gone above and beyond to fix a lot of these issues, obviously with the performances I spoke of. I know it's improved tenfold since then. And, I think our first playthrough, me and my two friends, took about 80 hours. And that was on the lower end compared to a lot of other people. But I love the game so much. And even after a long, long experience like that, when we were playing hours and hours on end, weeks later, I went and played through it again by myself, just with the NPCs, because I wanted to experience that side of things and explore things I hadn't in our first playthrough. And I loved it just as much. Obviously not, it's never going to be as good as the first time, but it was still pretty magical, and it just made me appreciate the game to another level, because there was entire areas of the first and second act which we didn't even know about, because we chose one minor decision, which we thought were minor. We chose one path instead of another, and completely missed, an area which I'm sure the developers, painstakingly spent hours and hours and hours making. And that just, it shows you they went the extra mile, the level of detail and care and effort put into the game. And as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong on this, but there was never a huge amount of crunch culture or toxicity at their studio, which I'm very, very appreciative and thankful of, because obviously that's a very common thing in the games industry, now more than ever, and it only seems to be getting worse. Naughty Dog are a very big example of that. I don't want to point fingers at particular studios, but generally speaking, the larger studio, the more problems there are on a structuring and fundamental level in terms of crunch culture, overtime, working mental health, etc. Larian, as far as I'm aware, hasn't run into that as many of those issues to a sort of larger extent, which just makes me appreciate the development team even more. And the last thing I'll say on this game really is, I talked about acknowledging being in the moment and acknowledging greatness with whatever you're doing, and that's a clear indication that you're in the midst of something special. And I said that about Baldur's Gate, and I stand by it, because when we finally did beat the game, there was actually a month or two where we just we couldn't really come together and finish it. So we were actually our campaign as a whole took months to actually finally beat. But when we did, for me personally, I can't speak for them, but it was just overwhelming kind of just sadness and frustration that I couldn't really relive those memories and recapture that magic ever again. It was never going to be the same. As I said, I played it twice through, but it wasn't as good as the first. And I don't think any gaming experience probably ever will be. And I hope I'm wrong in saying that. But as I said, I hold games to a very high standard. I've played a lot, and it takes a lot for me to really get invested in a game entirely across every aspect, narrative, gameplay, etc. This is a once in a lifetime experience of a title, and I really mean that as someone who's played, thousands of hours of games, since I was 3 years old. I can safely say probably the greatest gaming experience I've ever played, and I think ever been made, never will be made. If you haven't, do yourself a favor, go and pick it up right now.